Welcome to this webinar on the legal framework of orphanage trafficking. We will start very soon, but we will give participants a couple or 1 minute or two to drop in. While we are waiting for the rest to join, you're very welcome to write your name, your organization, what you're doing for work and country in the chat. And do remember to choose panelist and participant so we can all see what you're writing. I see people are dropping in, so we'll just wait like a minute or two more. You're very welcome. So we're expecting some more participants, and we're very happy to see that there are also new participants that didn't participate in previous webinars in this series. Hi, Georgette, very nice to see you in the chat, and I welcome some more of you to also write your name and where you're from, country and organization, and what you're doing. So this is also about you meeting each other. Perfect. Welcome, Cara, Catherine. So we will begin very soon, just 1 more minute to make people have the time to drop in. So I think it's time that we start. We have a very full agenda, so we'll use the time as good as possible. Perfect. Now I see a lot of names coming in. Welcome. So welcome everybody to this webinar, the legal framework of orphanage trafficking in Cambodia, Nepal, and Uganda. My name is Britta Holmberg. I'm the Program Director and Deputy Secretary General of World Childhood Foundation, and I have the privilege of being your moderator today. This webinar is the 9th webinar in a series for and by members of the Transforming Children's Care Global Collaborative Platform. And the platform is exactly that, a platform with the purpose to gather, develop and share learnings, expertise, and together drive the global agenda for better care. The webinar will be recorded, so those of you who are a bit late or need to do other things and miss really important part of it, or want to share with your colleagues and friends, you will be able to do so. And it will be available on the Global Collaborative Platform. You will also get a link to the platform and a link to the recorded webinar afterwards. You see that there is a Q&A. You can write your Q&As. So if you have questions, do write them down. And you, as some of you may know, you can also upvote questions that you also think is really interesting that others have been asking. So do you use that function as well? I think that was what is from housekeeping, and as I said in the beginning, do continue to write your name, who you are, and from which country in the chat, so others can see who you are, and this is also a networking opportunity. As you see, we have a very full agenda. I will not go through it in detail, but we will. It will give you both an understanding from a legal and theoretical framework about what is actually orphanage trafficking, but it will also show us and we will have a possibility to discuss and understand more about what this actually means in practice on the ground, including for children and young people that have been involved. So we will actually start very soon with a person with first-hand experience. But first, I want to give the word to Mary Keys from Law Future Centers, who is funding this research together with UBS Optimus Foundation. So please, Mary, I give the word to you.
Good evening from Australia, and thank you, Britta, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here for the launch of this project. As Britta said, I'm the director of the Law Futures Research Centre at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. Our centre conducts research on emerging challenges for law and legal institutions nationally and internationally, and this is underpinned by a strong commitment to social justice. We're especially proud of the groundbreaking and highly influential research into orphanage trafficking undertaken by our members, Dr. Kate Van Dor and Rebecca Knepp, of which this project forms a part. Their research on orphanage trafficking has led to important advances both academically and in the real world. The project on the legal framework of orphanage trafficking, about which we'll hear more in the presentations in this webinar, exemplifies many of the aims of the research undertaken at our centre. It will positively improve children's lives around the world, it will inform better policy, and it will influence academic debates. One of the most important aspects of this project is the way in which it involves academics working alongside partners outside universities to achieve strong outcomes. This project involves an important, constructive, and highly productive collaboration between UBS Optimus Foundation, Better Care Network, and our Academic Research Centre. I would like to acknowledge in particular UBS Optimus Foundation for their strong support of this project, which has made this research possible. Our centre also provided support, and such collaborations in co-funding and co-supporting research are vital to our mission. I would also like to acknowledge Better Care Network for their substantial contributions to this work, particularly through Rebecca Knepp's involvement. Like everyone here, I'm looking forward very much to hearing more about this project. Thank you for the invitation to participate and to say a few words, and congratulations to all involved on a most impressive report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And then I would like to give the word to a person who knows from first-hand experience about what this is all about. And Nepal was one of the countries where we first, as a world, started to understand that orphanage trafficking can actually be an issue. So Barma Udamagar from Care Experience Network Nepal, welcome.
Hello, namaste. Hello, namaste.
Namaste, we hear you. Welcome.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Namaste, I am Barma Mogar from Nepal with 11 years of care experience in different care settings. My mother says I was 5 years old when I, along with my 2 sisters and 1 brother, were separated from our family and were sent to an orphanage in a big city called Kathmandu. However, I don't remember about my brother as we were sent to the different orphanages. My 2 sisters and I were placed in the same orphanage, and there were many children like us. It took me time to realize that we were not getting proper food, proper clothes, and care that our mother promised we would get. The environment were very unhealthy for any children to grow. We were forced to beg in the street outside the orphanage so that we could manage food for ourselves and a caretaker. After some years, the orphanage owner decided to send my two sisters in another orphanage as I had a problem with my eye. I was stopped to go along with my sisters. I cried a lot and hugged my elder sister, asking her not to leave me alone. Seeing me cry, they decided to send me three of us in another orphanage. The second orphanage where we were sent provided us with a good facilities like education in boarding schools, proper food, and sleeping arrangement better than that we get in the first one. But we were not allowed to share about our biological family with anyone. We were threatened and abused both physically and mentally by the staff member of the orphanage where one of the child called her mother. The caretakers find out and she were kicked out from the orphanage. She stayed outside the orphanage gate for a day and later her mother came and took her home. One day, I knew that my mother and brother had come to visit us in the orphanage, but the staff member did allow us to meet them. My family were sent back without seeing us. In 2012, we were removed from the orphanage and sent to a transit care center where they helped us to find out our family. After we were home, I asked my mother about this entire orphanage journey. Her story were heartbreaking. She said, I paid rupees 30,000 for you three girls. The owner also said it was expensive to admit boys and they took rupees 45,000 for your brother. They said he would get to study as long as he wanted. That day, when I had seen my mother outside the orphanage gate, she was told by the owner that she had brought us from the previous orphanage. She had paid money to bring us to that orphanage. She could not believe that she heard. This is what I realized and had been trafficked. Now, I am a student of social work and currently I am involving in our network Signed Together Care Experience Network Nepal, where we advocate for the rights of children in care experience and raise awareness to prevent family separations. So, from my experience, I believe people who trafficked children in the name of the providing better education and facilities should be punished, and every country must have strong policy and laws to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that testimony, Barma, and thank you so much for the work that you're continuing to do also for other children in that situation. And we look forward to have you in the panel discussion after the other presentations. So if you have questions for Barma, do put them in the Q&A section. And now I have the pleasure to introduce a real power team. Rebecca Knepp from Better Care Network, who is one of our first and foremost global advocates in this issue, with a lot of experience both from the ground on a national level, but also very much on the global level. So Rebecca Knepp, and we also have Kate van Door from Griffith Law School, also a global advocate on this issue, and I believe one of the very first to establish the concept of orphanage trafficking. And you will present a really exciting study that you have been doing. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Britta. Thanks for that kind introduction. And thanks, friends and colleagues, for joining us today. We're really excited to share the findings of the first stage of our multi-stage, multi-country project with you. I want to start tonight, well, today for some of you, tonight for me, by acknowledging and extending my thank you and gratitude to the care leavers that are presenting today, Burma and Sinet. I just want to say to both of you that your lived experience is just so important to our work. And every time you speak, your words are so powerful and they really do move mountains, and everyone is listening when you speak. And they just continue to inspire and motivate us. And, you know, thank you for your generosity of spirit in sharing with us so that we can learn to do things better way for kids who are growing up in orphanages currently. I also want to acknowledge the wonderful partners that have come together that Mary spoke about a little bit earlier. This partnership between UBS Optimus Foundation, Better Care Network and Law Futures Centre draws together funding and expertise to address this, what might be referred to as a wicked problem. That is where children are growing up in orphanages for a purpose of profit. And that's the process we refer to as orphanage trafficking. Margot, can you swap the slide for me, please? Before I speak about the project, I just want to touch on a few key concepts that this project sort of talks about. And the first is orphanage trafficking. I'm assuming that because you're at a webinar about orphanage trafficking that you've probably heard of the concept. But the technical definition that we've been using for quite a few years now for orphanage trafficking is this idea that it's the recruitment or transfer of children to residential care institutions for a purpose of exploitation or profit. And it does sound a bit technical, but essentially it's a form of child trafficking that falls under the International Trafficking Protocol. And it's a term we use to describe the process of where children are either recruited into an orphanage by a middleman or an orphanage operator, or their parents are persuaded to place their children into an orphanage, as you just heard Burma talk about, where the orphanage is essentially running as a business. And that exploitation element that's referred to is seen when various harms might be enacted upon those children. So that can be anywhere from children being used in sexual exploitation to child labour, but it can also be things like where the institutionalisation of children is ongoing. There's no attempts to trace, reunify or reintegrate them with their families, and the children become a product virtually for consumerism in the orphanage tourism market. And orphanage tourism is the last one there that I've got. And then I'll talk a little bit about the context. But orphanage tourism is where people are visiting or volunteering in orphanages as part of a tourist trip. Sometimes they go specifically to these countries to volunteer in an orphanage, and that might look like a mission trip or something like that. But other times they're just staying in one of these countries, and the orphanage tourism is offered by a local hotel operator. It's facilitated by taxi drivers. It might form part of a larger package deal deal that's organised by a travel company for them. And this nexus of orphanage trafficking and orphanage tourism happens in countries which are mostly low and middle income countries, which largely have child protection systems that are privatized. And by that, we mean that are largely predominantly foreign funded. And that foreign funding of child protection systems takes it out of the kind of government remit and means that governments often, because of lack of resourcing, can't effectively enforce minimum standards or regulate those orphanages or residential care centres like they should be being regulated. So that forms the basis of what this study is about. Can I have the next slide, please? So as Britta mentioned, Rebecca and I both have extensive experience in this area. We've both been involved in transitioning residential care centres. And one of the major frustrations in that work that we've seen over and over again is that often nothing happens to the orphanage operator. You can have a very poorly run residential care centre and children in dire need, and the orphanage might be closed, but nothing happens to the operator. And if they are charged with an offence, often it's for a low-level offence. So it would be just the form of exploitation. So maybe they get charged with child neglect or child abuse or sexual abuse. And these are offences that have low-level penalties often. If they are charged with trafficking, often the cases aren't put together very well and those trafficking cases fall over. And so what this project is aiming to understand is why that's happening. These, in many cases, are relatively straightforward cases of child trafficking. Why do they not get identified? Why, if they do get identified, do they fail at the prosecution section? Why does why do they get prosecuted for exploitation rather than trafficking, which fails to acknowledge the systemic nature of this process? So we're doing this in sort of 4 stages, and stage 1 is what we're looking at tonight. We've completed, and stage 1 looked at the legal framework domestically of orphanage trafficking, how it might be charged and prosecuted under the existing frameworks, and how we should look at prosecuting into the future and prevention into the future. The second stage and third stage, which Rebecca and I are currently working on, is looking at how we understand governments, law enforcement and courts are currently responding to orphanage trafficking. And then the fourth stage is that we develop training and sensitisation programs that assist with enhancing the identification of orphanage trafficking, leading to hopefully increased prosecution and better prosecution practices around this offence, and hopefully eventually prevention. Slide, please. A little bit about why we chose these particular countries, Cambodia, Nepal and Uganda. So each of these countries has had orphanage trafficking documented for quite some time, at least since the early 2000s. And these countries are mostly moving towards deinstitutionalisation in an attempt to curb the inappropriate or over-institutionalisation of children. But some in these countries, their efforts are being frustrated by orphanage trafficking. We've got high numbers of reports of child exploitation occurring in institutions in these countries, and we have large numbers of children living in unregistered care facilities. And I want to make a point here about registered and unregistered care facilities. Orphanage trafficking doesn't only occur in unregistered care facilities, it can also be occurring in registered care facilities. We also see that these countries are very popular destinations for orphanage tourism, and those orphanages are often located in tourist hubs where the number of orphanages does not correlate with an increased vulnerability for children in those areas. So something else is going on there. Why are so many children in orphanages when they probably don't need to be in those areas? The other thing about these 3 countries is that they're from completely different regions. So we've got one in the African continent, we've got one in South Asia, and we've got one in Southeast Asia. And yet the modus operandi of orphanage trafficking is the same in each of those countries, and indeed in each of those regions. So we see a pattern of this process occurring in the same way. Why is that happening? How is it that that exact same process is happening across these 3 different continents? So we're very interested in that as well. Slide, please. So the next stage of the presentation is Rebecca and I are going to take you just briefly through some of our findings in each of the countries. Slide, please. And I'm going to start with Nepal. And then I will hand over to Rebecca to talk about Cambodia and Uganda. So in Nepal, when we looked at the domestic jurisdiction of policy and law relating to orphanage trafficking, we found that there were 4 laws that were relevant. So the Constitution of Nepal from 2007, the Criminal Code of 2017, the Act relating to children, which is relatively recent, 2018, and the Human Trafficking and Transportation Act of 2007. Now, of course, the latter is sort of the most imperative act here, the Human Trafficking and Transportation Act, and it defines human trafficking and transportation as 2 separate offences, and it criminalises both of them, but there are differences between them. So the main difference between trafficking and transportation under this act is that transportation offences don't include movement of the victim, whereas transportation offences do include movement of the victim. I knew I was going to get that wrong, whereas trafficking offences do not. And we found, just very briefly, and you'll have to read the report if you want to know more, we found that under the current law, orphanage trafficking most likely should be prosecuted under the human transportation offence. And indeed, there has been some cases where orphanage trafficking has been prosecuted in the lower courts of Nepal as trafficking or transportation, but those decisions aren't publicly available. Just briefly, some of the challenges we found with prosecuting orphanage trafficking in Nepal is that institutionalization is still very widely practiced and quite accepted. So when orphanages are closed, trafficking is not at the front of the government's mind when they're closing enacting closure. And where they do occur, the prosecutions, like I mentioned before, are not for trafficking, they're for those low-level exploitation offences. And very often those fall over. Nepal very recently was the 176th country to ratify the trafficking protocol just in 2020. And now they're about to embark on harmonising their anti-trafficking laws, which will lead to a whole overhaul of the definition of trafficking, and hopefully it will fall more in line with the trafficking protocol. So for the moment, Nepal in this is in a little bit of a state of limbo. The laws as we find them are still enacted, so there still is potential for orphanage trafficking to be prosecuted, but we are in a little bit of watch this space. So I'm going to just hand over to Beck for Cambodia and Uganda. Thanks, Beck.
Thanks, Kate, for that. Yeah, in terms of Cambodia, I think what was most striking about the Cambodian legal framework is that the human trafficking laws had been amended in 2008, and you can see what the laws are there on your screen. And changes had been made at that time to the definitional contours of the trafficking offences, and specifically adoption and profit had been included as purposes in addition to the more traditional forms of exploitation that were already in the preceding act. But at the same time, changes were made to the criminal code, and offences had been added to criminalise conduct that pertain to certain recruiting practices that are often part of illicit inter-country adoptions, such as inciting abandonment of a child. And so in general, what we saw was that the impetus for amending the Trafficking Act was to bring it into conformity with the trafficking protocol. But the addition of profit and adoption as purposes in the trafficking offences, along with the criminalisation of some of the recruitment practices in the criminal code, they were actually made in an attempt to operationalise the Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption and bring Cambodia's laws into conformity with those standards. However, in addition to deterring illicit adoptions and for-profit adoptions, these amendments actually paved a much clearer pathway for the prosecution of orphanage trafficking in cases where the unlawful removal of a child and admission into an orphanage was to profit from the child's ongoing institutionalisation, not just to move them into an inter-country adoption situation. So under the Cambodian laws, trafficking offences are defined as the unlawful removal with purpose. And for a minor, unlawful removal is further defined as without legal authority or any legal justification to do so, to take a minor or a person in the general custody or curatorship or legal custody away from the legal custody of their parents or their caretaker or their guardian. And the legal powers and justifications for a child's removal and admission into care are all very, very clearly spelled out in Cambodia's alternative care laws and regulations, and also in the Civil Code. So it's not difficult to differentiate between what constitutes a lawful and an unlawful removal and admission of a child into an orphanage. And if that removal and admission is unlawful and exploitation or profit was the purpose, then that act constitutes a trafficking offence which can be theoretically prosecuted under the existing laws. Next slide, please, Margot. In Uganda, there were 2 trafficking offences in the Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act that were relevant to orphanage trafficking and its potential prosecution. And these were found in Section 4, which is the offence of aggravated trafficking in persons, and in Section 5, which was trafficking in children. And unlike in Cambodia, profit is not an explicit inclusion as a purpose in these offences. And therefore it is a barrier, as it means that in cases where children are recruited for profit purposes and where other forms of exploitation, such as sexual exploitation or labour, were not present or intended, it might be more challenging to prosecute orphanage trafficking for profit under the existing offences. But what is interesting about the Ugandan legal framework is that there are 2 elements in Section 4 offence on aggravated trafficking that are really relevant, as they recognise the role that alternative care providers can play in the trafficking of a child. And the first is in Section 4B, which recognises that when adoption, guardianship, fostering or other orders in relation to children is undertaken for the purpose of exploitation, then it constitutes aggravated trafficking. Section 4D says that when the offender is an organisation engaged in the activities of organising, directing or protecting vulnerable persons in society, and they also engage in unlawful removal for the purpose of exploitation, then it is an aggravated offence. Now, Section 4B, which talks about the care orders, can only really capture trafficking that is happening in approved children's homes because they are the ones that are able to receive a child under a care order. But Section 4D could theoretically be used to capture unregistered or unapproved children's homes that are run by charitable organisations. So even though all trafficking cases involve children are aggravated, the inclusion of these sections is positive because it gives recognition to the fact that children can be trafficked under the guise of providing alternative care. So it may increase visibility of the issue, and it may help to remove some of the interpretation barriers. Both the Ugandan trafficking offences are predicated on the unlawful removal of a child as the first element, similar to the Cambodian ones. And the Children's Act very clearly outlines the powers and the grounds for lawful removal and makes it, again, very easy to differentiate between what constitutes a lawful and an unlawful removal and admission into a childcare institution. In addition, unlawful removal and operating in unapproved children's homes are both independent offences under the Children's Act, and they both carry penalties of fines and imprisonment. There are also other ancillary offences in the Trafficking Act and in the Children's Act and in the Penal Code that could be relevant in a prosecutorial strategy that capture other elements of offences. Next slide, please. So in terms of challenges, the 2 biggest challenges that we really saw as a result of this stage 1 research was with prosecuting orphanage trafficking offences are the knowledge of orphanage trafficking and its indicators, and the ability to interpret those indicators in the context of the existing criminal offences and trafficking offences. Orphanage trafficking happens under the guise of a child protection intervention, which means that people don't often expect it, they're not often looking for it, they may not interpret the indicators accurately when they come across them. And indicators of orphanage trafficking are therefore often not reported, even under mandated reporting mechanisms, and they're often not investigated. They're frequently dismissed or dealt with under regulation. For example, they may be detected in a minimum standards inspection of an orphanage, but then they may be addressed as a minimum standards issue versus being detected as potential criminal activity and referred to law enforcement to be dealt with through criminal law mechanisms. Another barrier is that victims and their families don't often realise that what has transpired may actually constitute trafficking or be criminal until it reaches that higher threshold of sexual exploitation or very overt labour exploitation. So they may also not make reports to law enforcement. In addition, many times we find children don't disclose their experiences in these orphanages until they have left. And that can be, many, many years later, which might mean that at that point, reporting and collecting evidence might be more complicated. There's also this distrust in many of these countries of the legal system that can further deter their reporting. Police and investigators may also have quite limited understanding of what constitutes unlawful removal, because it's sort of an element that sits more in the child protection space. And that often means that unless there is sexual or labour exploitation involved, trafficking isn't detected even when elements may be reported. But when sexual or labour exploitation is presented, as Kate mentioned, often those lower level offences are brought and charges are brought, but trafficking charges are not actually brought against those offenders. There can also be a lack of political will to prosecute the orphanage trafficking offences, particularly in cases where there might be some level of involvement, knowingly or otherwise, of officials, oftentimes lower level, community level, local government officials who may have signed documents along the way or been complicit in the issuing of falsified birth records or abandonment certificates or things like that. Next slide, please, Margot. So in terms of ways forward, there were a few recommendations that came out of the research as to how we might be able to address these barriers, including raising awareness of orphanage trafficking amongst the stakeholders most likely to receive reports or disclosures or to uncover indicators in the course of their work. And that includes law enforcement, judiciary, social workers who work on reintegration cases, and child protection authorities. Also integrating the indicators of orphanage trafficking, which are quite different to other forms of trafficking, into victim identification and detection frameworks, such as the formal victim identification guidelines, residential care minimum inspection frameworks, and also in community awareness raising materials. And this could ensure that orphanage trafficking crimes and their victims and perpetrators are more systematically identified and uncovered and referred for investigation and support. We also need to advocate for stronger enforcement of existing laws and policies, particularly those around operating unlawful institutions, unlawfully removing children and admitting them into care. This behaviour remains very widespread in all 3 countries included in the study, despite being an offence carrying penalties and sentences. So there needs to be much stronger enforcement of those laws and monitoring. It's also important that the RCI closure procedures are developed and include guidance on how to detect indicators of orphanage trafficking that may be there and the reporting mechanisms that need to be followed in those cases. On the legislative front, it's important that profit is better recognised as a purpose for trafficking under domestic laws. And this may in some countries require amendments to the trafficking offences. In others, it may be a matter of issuing interpretive guidance for the exploitation component so that law enforcement, judges, investigators may better understand how to implement and how to follow those particular laws and increase the level of prosecution of these crimes. So that's kind of the summary of our key findings from the country and sort of what it's starting to point to in terms of next steps and next directions that'll carry over into the current stage of the research that we are currently undertaking. Thank you. I'll pass back to Britta.
Thank you so much, Kate and Rebecca. This is a very it's a lot of details, a lot of information, a lot of legal information. So I assume that the people listening may have some clarifying questions. So do ask these questions in the Q&A. We will follow up very soon. But I think it is therefore also very good to invite the next speaker, because now we have, at least theoretically, the framework that it is possible to prosecute for orphanage trafficking. But I think it would be really interesting to understand more what it actually means in practice. Can these cases be detected? And if so, what is the implication on the country level? And we already heard one testimonial from Nepal, but now I would like to invite Anju Pun from Forget Me Not Nepal, who is an organization that has been doing a lot of work in this field. So welcome, Anju.
Thank you, Britta. Good evening, everyone from Kathmandu. Britta, can I have the first slide, please? Yes. Thank you for this opportunity to share the groundworks in terms of orphanage trafficking, the legal framework in action in ground. I work for Forget Me Not, and we work to prevent children and young people around the world from being displaced through investing in innovative initiatives that keep children within their families and communities. To achieve this, we work alongside National Child Rights Council, provincial governments, and local municipalities on prevention work, on care reform and deinstitutionalization efforts. We work through our local partner NGO in Nepal, and having worked for nearly 2 decades, we have been going through national reports, the laws that is in place, what are the challenges, and I would like to share some of the findings here. In the first slide, you can see that according to the State of Children in Nepal 2020 report, there are, oops, we went to the second slide. Okay, I'll refer to the first slide. Yeah, thank you. There are 11,350 children in 489 registered childcare homes in 45 districts of Nepal. And the report also shows that 74% of these institutions are located in key tourist destinations. It is also interesting to note that the funding stream analysis of alternative care in Nepal has identified that 90% of funding into these privately run institutions come from foreign countries. And the family reintegration work, the prevention work which we have been doing in ground, it has clearly identified and generated enough evidences to show that child trafficking is happening in institutions in Nepal. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our analysis report of 2021, which gathers the information from previous 9 to 10 years of our work, interviews with children and families, the various government reports, it all shows that we identified that there are 14 identified districts which are the source of orphanage trafficking. And in this map, you can see that there are 14 districts highlighted in red. And you can also see the destination districts, which are mainly the key tourist destinations, which was shared by Dr. Kate Van Doore and Rebecca also. So here you can see that 38% of sample size which we have analyzed, it clearly shows that the districts from where the children are recruited into these institutions, the families they have been lured under false promises of better education, better opportunities in the cities, and that's how the children are actively recruited into such institutions. And we can clearly see the evidences, the testimonies as shared by Burma also. Next slide, please. Here in the next slide, I would like to share with you the kind of money transaction which is happening from these vulnerable families. And it is very interesting to note that the lowest amount is per child which is taken from the families is $40 USD, and the maximum amount of which is taken is $2,200 USD. And there might be a question in your head that how come this such a big variance in the amount per child. And I would like to share here that through the investigation and after family reintegration interviews, we came to know that the broker, the middleman, the trafficker, when they go into such villages, remote villages, they negotiate with the families. And the amount which you see here, it's not the families giving away from their bank account, nothing like that. What they do is they take loan from the neighbors and they collect the money and they give away to the brokers or to the middlemen. And the negotiation happens based on based on the skills of this of the broker, who visits the families in the villages. Here you can see there are 12 institutions, childcare homes between 2012 to 2021, where we have analyzed the reports. And this also involves the interviews with the traffickers and the brokers also. Thank you. Next slide, please. So when we talk about what happens once the institution is closed, or when the operators are, how they are prosecuted in Nepal. So when we looked into the past data, we found that 10 childcare homes operators or the traffickers, they were arrested firstly. And after the arrest, what we noted that they are the kind of cases files against them or the charges pressed against them, it is either offense as fraud under fraud cases or offenses against child. So these carry very minimal penalties. So the traffickers or the orphanage operators, they can easily move out from the jail in bail. So can we go to the next slide, please? For example, the prosecuted cases here I would like to share with you. Maya Devi Orphan and Helpless Children Protection Center, Rupandehi, in this district in 2015, government intervened and they rescued 30 children from there. And there were cases of exploitation of children, removal of children, unnecessary family separation. There was a father who went to the orphanage director asking his 2 sons to get back to his family. But the orphanage director, he declined him and said that he has already signed the documents. So in such cases, the orphanage operator was charged with fraud, and later he was easily released in bail. And similarly, in 2019, there was another orphanage from where 19 children were rescued. And the orphanage operator had collected 35,000 to 220,000 Nepali rupees from families. Again, in this case, despite having all the evidences of exploitation of children, how the violence was happening inside the orphanage, and how the tourists were easily going and playing with the children, despite all these evidences, the operator was charged with fraud cases. And he was again, he was out in bail. Next slide, please. Similarly, in 2019, 2 cases were there. And in these 2 cases, again, money was involved. Children were kept in very vulnerable situations. They had not abided by the standard operating procedures of the government to run children's homes. The children were forcibly declared as orphans. And despite having all these evidences, unfortunately, the cases were pressed against offenses against child with minimal charges, and they were released in bail. In both the situation, it's the same story. In Saudol Mahila Samaj Sanstha Bhaktapur 2019, here a child was sexually abused. And in this case also, because there was no trafficking law as such to address this issue, despite the heinous crime, the case could not fall under Human Trafficking and Transportation Act, even though the operator was behind the bar. The husband, who was the main culprit, was not arrested. Next slide, please. I'm sorry the electricity went off here this side, but we have backup for internet. Similarly, in 2016, there was this orphanage, Maya Orphanage, who operated Jerusalem Antioch Church in Dhankuta district. Here in this case, this is the first case where the operator was prosecuted under Human Trafficking and Transportation Control Act 2017. And the reason why is because the child rights officer that time who led this case in this district, he understood, he had this knowledge and awareness that this is orphanage trafficking. And that is why in his leadership and in coordination in generating all the evidences from the children, our partner NGO and we together jointly filed this case. However, again, the person was released on bail, unfortunately. The operator's family at the same time filed a writ against illegal confinement of children to protect the accused. So this is a very normal practice here. So the moment the operator is arrested or there is some kind of charges against him or her, the family or the closer relatives, they immediately go and file this writ against illegal confinement, because the children from such orphanages are removed by the Nepal government and placed in transitional care. So the NGO, or let's say our partner NGO, against them, this writ was filed. But later it was all dismissed because of the letters we were provided by the government and their sole leadership into the removal of these children. Next slide, please. Here, during the pandemic in 2020, there were 11 children in this orphanage, childcare orphanage. And in this situation also, the operator had collected money from each families, and the girl child who is in this picture, she is giving her statement to Central Child Justice Committee members who visited to collect statement, and later a video call was done with the judge of Supreme Court. In this case, the operator again had charged, filed a writ against illegal confinement of children against National Child Rights Council, municipality where this orphanage was placed, and the ward office. So here in this process, this was the first time that the government, against the government, a writ was filed. So here, Central Child Justice Committee, they came into action, they visited our transitional care home, and here the child is clearly giving her a testimony saying that mommy means the orphanage operator, so all children called her mommy. So she said that mommy would send me to International Money Express to withdraw money sent by people. She gets lots of money from people in Nepal and other countries. Many tourists used to come to our orphanage and they stayed with us. I had dreamt of going to a boarding school in Kathmandu, but nothing happened like that. So this was her testimony, and similarly other 10 children also gave their testimony to Central Child Justice Committee. The orphanage was closed. Children were safely reintegrated back to their families, but unfortunately, again, no further charges were pressed to the operator. So this is the reality. You reality check what's happening here in ground. Next slide, please. So the barriers to prosecution, which is previously shared by Kate also. Orphanage trafficking in Nepal, it is not specifically identified in Nepal's law. The cases are charged, filed based on the nature of the offense and the knowledge, how much the knowledge the official carries. So that's based on that, the cases are filed here. Child trafficking into orphanages has been prosecuted as fraud or offenses against child. And a rare case that happened in 2016, where a post-earthquake case was charged under HTTA 2007. Political connections wrongly used to minimize the gravity of the charged cases, unfortunately. Perpetrators released on bail. We have not yet seen a case where there is a prosecution and children, and even the victim compensation to exploited children and their families, it's never done. So these are the key barriers which we are facing here in ground. And at the end, in the next slide, I would like to just quote a child who said that I cannot change what happened to me, but the culprits, the traffickers, the middlemen, whatever you call them, who separated me from my family, saw me crying and being exploited. They are still living freely in our community, who will punish them? So that's her question, and so many other children's question who are back to their families carrying those wounds in them. And as Burma said, that when we talk to her, she is not able to understand that all orphanage trafficking had happened to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Anju, and I think we will have that, bear that quote with us. And thank you so much for the double reality check and for continuing even though the electricity went out. So we will have one more a presentation from the national level from Cambodia, and we are inviting Nut D, the national director from Dai Coalition Cambodia, that will share some of your experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for this privilege, and I would like to pay my respect to everyone's brief. So, well, thank you so much. I will talk a little bit about the legal perspective with my experience that I have worked with one orphanage before I joined in Dai. So I give you a little bit background about Cambodia regarding to residential care mappings that was conducted by UNICEF and with USAID funds and with mostly mean that the Ministry of Social Affairs and that mappings with 20 provinces. So this is the results that they found out. They found us is there is 639 residential cares, we can say facilities in Cambodia. So they categorize into 5 kinds. Is one is they have residential cares institutions, or sometimes they call RCIs. So there are 406 residential cares and 25 transition home temporary emergency accommodations, and also there are 71 home group home as well, and another 65 is pagoda and faith-based that they have building for children as well. Another 72 is boarding school. So total is about 639 facilities in Cambodia when the Moswe and UNICEF makes this. Yeah, next slide. Well, we talked about a lot about, especially about the orphanage traffic. So let me a little bit work on this, especially the orphanage that I work with. This we can say that even though there are many laws and policies haven't have issues, and then we have to follow, but there is still have many institutions unregistered and unregulated as well. Especially according to the findings, we have seen that at least 38% of RCI not inspected by Muslims, and also 12% RCI not registered with any branch of governments, and also along with 21% RCI not having MOU or memorandum with the government as well. So this is the findings that UNICEF and OSCE have done. Next slide, please. Okay, wait. Actually, it's can you back a little bit? So we can I can talk a little bit about the situations with the orphanage or RCI that unregistered or unregulated. So I can describe in 4 points. Is a weak management frameworks. It means lack of policy and widespread misappropriate of fund as well. So it means that we can see that even though policy available, but there is no like child protections policy, safeguarding, there is no that. And also funding, there is no management or accountability and transparency in using funds as well. So lack of accountability is a widespread nepotisms, which prevent report and add to the close environment of orphanage. It means that that orphanage is run by the group of the people that they are supplying or they are relative. For example, like center managers is husband, and center director is wife, and also finance and admins is nephews or niece as well, and also the caregivers are their aunties or relative as well. So we can say that when this is happening, there is a lack of accountability. So there will be a close environment of the orphanage. Atmosphere of violence can be linked to the lack of accountability if they are run by a group of people that they are relative of any sensitive issue that happen. There won't be any report on that. So there is abuse, exploitation, harassment, and sexual assault, trafficking, threats, manipulate, sabotage of the reintegration, and inappropriate conduct as well. So based on my practice and also my experience on that, I could see that, for example, like this threat, somehow this threat to the new staff who come to support, especially social worker that hired by another partner in order to support to the caregiver. But when the social worker approach to the center, you know, those children was manipulated by the center manager. They allow children to harm to the social workers in different ways. And number 4, I can say, is fraudulent practice, falsified birth certificate, change name, fakes, child bios sent to the donor. You know, based on my experience, I got information from the donor that, oh, what this child was collected from the rabbis, and this child was sold by the mothers. I can say it's naturally no mother can sell their children even though they are poor or they are very poor. And also, if you look at the birth certificate, they change the names, you know, of the children. For example, their name is naturally, actually in Cambodia name, it should be, you know, in the Cambodia context, not like Western name, you know, like Joseph, Peter, or Johannes, Matthew, something like that. So we can figure out that it's a very sensitive information that falsifies as well. So this is that I found out, and I can list down more, but due to the time, I can list down only 4 of that. Next slide, please. Well, I can talk more on the nature of abuse, exploitation, and orphanage complicit in the trafficking of children. Yeah, of course, there are physical abuse, sexual abuse, and exploitation, emotional abuse, accommodation, commodification, children just for profit. So, for example, like you say about physical abuse, actually might be, but the case that I met is children was physical abuse until they have a critical, severe sickness, and because they break, their head was broken, and then it was that child was sent to the Vietnam, and then after that went to the Opa in Siem Reap and to treat. But later on, I went to the side and then figure out that that child were dead already. So yeah, sexual abuse also happening as well, because there was staff call a young man into the rooms, and then they have sexual abuse and harassment happening, and child found out, and other children found out, and others image that we could see from the child behavior and that they show to us as well, and they somehow they tell us well. Emotional abuse, of course, it's very important, and how we can figure out, because we could see that some children are not allowed to go to visit their families, even though those children could have their families or they have family, but we figure out that those children are neglected. They were neglected, and their emotional is they say this alone, and they just like when we question them, they want to have family, they want to go to visit their family during the occasional, like my New Year or water festival or something. So this separation affect to their family as well. Yep.
No, I need to ask you to wrap up 1 more minute, and then we need to hand over to the next speaker.
Okay, so we can go to next slide, and then everyone can read more on the slide. Yeah, factors that lead to the child removals. There are many actually. Yeah, but of course, because of the profit, they remove the family, children from their family, because they said that okay, the family need money and then they can support those children. And somehow they remove the children from their family because they fake the information, because somehow they found the children along the street and then they pick up and then were brought to the center or transit to another orphanage or OCRs. And also another purposes is for funding, because according to my experience, they got funding from some donor through sending fake informations. Well, I think you can read more on that because a lot of information here. Yeah. Next slide, please. That I want to focus on. Yeah, barrier to detect orphanage trafficking in Cambodia. Yeah, limited awareness among law enforcement and child protections. Well, authorities, they don't understand orphanage trafficking and its indicators. Yeah, somehow they don't know. They just say, okay, it's fine because if we are Khmer, we can support to the children. So no need to further any question or any discussion on any argument on that. So somehow it's like that. Limited awareness among social workers, yeah, and also reintegration officers as well. So we can say that social workers can be good at care plans or counseling, but they don't know or they have a little knowledge on the law enforcement and policy regarding to protection to the children and report to the children as well.
I need to thank you very much. I know you have a lot more to say and we have a lot more to listen to. So I would like to just invite the final panelist, and then we will have some time together, all of us. So thank you so much. And it's really, really important to hear both the opportunities, but also the barriers and challenges on country level. And now we have, so we started with lived experience from a young person, and we also want to end there. And Sinette Jan from Meng Onka Care Levels, I understand that you had firsthand experience and kind of had to fight not only with the exploited, but also with the system that didn't really see or understand what you were going through. So welcome, Sinette.
Hello, my name is Sinette. I am an orphanage survivor, child rights activist, and the leader of a care leaver network at Cambodia Children's Trust. I was born in Bat Nabong province in northwest Cambodia. My family were living in terrible poverty. After both of my parents died from HIV, my sister, brothers, and I were separated from our 2 older brothers and sent to live in an orphanage funded by foreigners from around the world. At first, I thought living in an orphanage might give me a good opportunity to study, but when I arrived at the orphanage, I began to feel very unsafe. The other children and I were badly neglected, and we never had enough to eat despite regular visits from foreigners who would make big donations. Mostly we ate leftover food sent to us from the nearby pagoda. Some days we had to find our own food, and we would catch mice and fish from surrounding rice fields. We were forced to work every morning and evening doing hard manual labor on the land owned by the orphanage director. We were working as slaves. When I was younger, I thought of this activity as a mean of survival, but now I realize it was a form of exploitation for profit. The orphanage director also physically abused us, and I was raped for many years. He threatened to kill me if I ever told anyone. I lived in fear and was scared all the time. After I was removed from the orphanage and feel safe in the care of another organization, I report the sexual abuse and exploitation to the police. There were other children still living in the orphanage, but no action was taken. The director of the orphanage was allowed to continue running the orphanage even though he committed many crimes, including orphanage trafficking. He was never charged. It took another 12 years to finally get his orphanage shut down. In that time, hundreds more children would have been harmed and experienced trauma that stay with them for their life. Between 2005 and 2010, the number of the orphanage in Cambodia increased by more than 75%. And the number of children living in orphanages nearly doubled. Nearly half of these orphanages were unregistered and taking children unlawfully. These institutions were exploiting children for profit and some were trafficking children. Despite having law that criminalize all these acts, many perpetrators have gone unpunished, continue to go unpunished, and continue to run abusive orphanages. A few offenders who sexually abuse children have been prosecuted, but no offender were charged with trafficking children into orphanages. For children and young people who are at risk or have been victims of orphanage trafficking and exploitation crimes, there are many barriers to reporting and to getting justice. Firstly, when I report what was happened to me, the Child Protection Authority did not take it seriously and did not respond according to their own law and politics. They did not take steps to protect the children in the orphanage. They left children in his care. They let him continue to run an unregistered orphanage. This discouraged children and young people from reporting because they do not trust that they will be listened to or that their report will be acted on. They worry they will be even more at risk if the abuser know they reported and they are remaining in their care. In the orphanage I was in, when child protection officials went to do their inspection of the orphanage after the report were made, the children were no longer confident to disclose any abuse to the authority because they were scared and because the authority had not acted to protect them when the first report were made. So they stay silent and suffer ongoing exploitations. In my case, I eventually made a formal complaint to the court to press charge against the offender. In the initial investigation, they did not look at my case as trafficking, even though I was unlawfully removed from my home and extended family and placed in unregistered orphanage. They only look at the rape element. And the police and the investigating prosecutor all accused me of lying about being raped. They did not take it seriously. They threatened me with defamation charge and threatened that I would be prosecuted. They said they sided with the offender from even though it was their job to protect me and seek justice for me as a victim. This behavior from the police and the prosecutors stopped children from being willing to report and from being willing to give testimony in court case. I was threatened by my abuser after I filed a charge, and the police did nothing to protect me. I eventually withdrew the charge because of this. This happened in a lot of cases, and it's a big barrier to orphanage traffickers being prosecuted and punished for their crimes. So in my case, the authority fell at every level. At the level of child protection officials who did not implement their responsibility for children in residential care, and at the level of law enforcement who did not take report seriously and investigated appropriately, rather threaten me as a victim with charge. This practice need to stop so that children and young people can feel confident to make a report and trust they will be listened to and that the law will be used to protect them and to give them access to justice. In my professional opinion, they are things that must change. First, state must have offenses that criminalize operating unregistered orphanages, admitting children unlawfully, exploiting children in care, including for profit, and they must use them and prosecute offenders. Two, state must improve the detection of orphanage trafficking, crime, and orphanage trafficking victims and respond when these cases are discovered using the law available. Three, state must end impunity for offenders who traffic, abuse, and exploit children in orphanages and run unregistered orphanages. Four, caregivers who have been abused or exploited should have access to free legal service and support to access justice so that they can safely and with support seek evidence as to whether what have happened to them is a crime, report those crimes, and seek justice through the courts. Many caregivers, like myself, have lived through exploitation, abuse, and neglect, and have been used for profit in care. I'm not sharing my story for pity. One thing us caregivers have in common is that we want change and we want justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sina. That was really, really powerful and important. Thank you for that. We have a couple of minutes for discussion, so I would like to ask the panelists to put on their cameras and microphones when you will speak. I would like to start with the word and the framing, trafficking. It is quite a powerful word, and even though especially UK, but also I think a lot of people in this webinar have been working with that concept for quite a while, we now have an even stronger kind of legal framework and underpinning for using that, and also in prosecution. But and Kate, you were talking about your frustration in the speech that, you know, nothing is happening. We continue to raise awareness. We're working with this issue. We show the alternatives, and still the traffickers, they are, you know, they go unpunished. And we heard the same and even stronger from Burma, Anju and Sinet, you know, that people are actually, they just continue to remove new children to unregistered orphanages and use them for profit. Do you think, or do you hope that this research and the framing is a new and better strategy to change that? Kate, we start with you.
Sure. Great question, Britta, as always. I think that we've made great strides in the last few years, particularly, and we've gone from a situation where a lot of NGOs thought it was a form of trafficking, but we didn't have any recognition of it, to now a stage where it is being recognized. It's being recognized by domestic governments. We've had, you know, the UN with it included in a resolution. We've got a framework that is establishing around this issue that is enabling us to then, a little bit like a series of dominoes or levers, that we can now pull on and push that right domino to get more action on the ground. So it does take time. I think one of the strategies we've been using as advocates and people working in this area is a top-down but bottom-up approach at the same time. So that top-down, like the UN things and the government work, that's pushing down, but at the same time, organizations that, you know, like Wenue and Anshu work are doing that groundwork that's really increasing awareness and sensitization of the issue and driving it up. So I'm hoping we're coming to a spot where we meet in the middle and we start to see some of that more specific law be enacted, which we think will be, you know, a bit of a game changer here. Beck might like to say something on that. I'm not sure.
No, I think that was a very articulate response to the frustration. There is hope, there is promise, there is movement, and I think as a global community of advocates and activists, and we will continue working until we see that tipping point.
And what about the others, Knut? Do you agree? Does it help the framework of trafficking in your work?
Yeah, I think it's really good yeah, to have a framework of that, and especially like Ted mentioned as well, we can do both from top down and bottom up as well to work on that.
And what about you talked about, you know, how this research would influence, and that we need to inform legal representatives in these countries, orphanage people, NGOs, people who were working in the orphanages, and also families and communities. But what about funders and supporters in other countries? Do you think that using the lens of trafficking, that what you are contributing to is actually trafficking, would that be even more deterrent? Maybe a leading question that I'm really curious to hear. Is that something you use in your advocacy? Maybe to Anju.
Yes, of course. I think that is a very important question because as I shared that 90% of funding to the privately run institutions in Nepal, all the money is coming from outside the country, which means that the donors, well-intentioned people, they need to be equally informed and educated and sensitized via various platforms. For example, this one we are talking right now, I think this is going to really be an eye-opener for many, and there need to be all kinds of advocacy at all levels, parliaments, governments, you know, civil society, activists, all coming together to raise awareness to the donors as well, so that the problem is not fueled and children are not trafficked unnecessarily, you know, and they are with their families.
Thank you.
Well, I just add a little bit on that, not on just donors, but also the volunteer, because many Western countries are, you know, they have a in a short-term mission, something like that. They need to explore more on that, how the effort called to work with the orphanage, or how they can collect, especially like orphanage that I was work, I worked because the fund from the church base. So I think it's very important to be alert to inform to the church as well, to consider before they come, because normally this is about compassions, rather than the strategies to funding. And a lot of short-term mission, especially students from the university, they come to volunteer at orphanage. So this is should be explored most. And children and family, they have like occurrence courses that could help to the short-term mission and also volunteer or students from universities. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, since this is an issue that I think many of you already mentioned that, the orphanage trafficking is usually, made under the guise of helping, and therefore it might be hard to prove. And we have a question in the Q&A from Julie about, how can we prove the intent? And I assume that is a huge barrier. Maybe Kate, for you to start on that one as well.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that one. So Julie's asking about intent within prosecution and whether there'd have to be clear evidence of profit or exploitation to tip ignorant caregiving into orphanage trafficking. So I'm going to give a very lawyerly response, Julie, and say it depends. It depends on how the law in that country is drafted. It depends on the elements that are included for trafficking in that law. So standardly under the international law, we see 3 elements of trafficking. The first is what we call act, the second is means, and the third is a purpose of exploitation. For child trafficking, and under the international law, no means is required. So that defrauding element or that trickery element isn't required in child trafficking. You just need an action of a child being recruited or transferred, and you need a purpose of exploitation. So at what stage does exploitation, or does, children being in an orphanage become a form of exploitation? I want to be really clear about this because there's been confusion. Orphanage tourism in and of itself may not be exploitative, but it's a spectrum, okay? Exploitation occurs on a spectrum. So in some laws, exploitation is very defined. So it'll say exploitation includes sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, things like that. In other laws, like the Nepali law that we discussed tonight, it's a very open interpretation and just says exploitation. So you're free to argue what you think is exploitation in that element, and that's what lawyers do. So I guess in countries where the law is like that, we're looking for lawyers to make those more innovative arguments. In countries where we've got exploitation very defined, we have to be very conscious of those forms of exploitation and looking for those forms of exploitation when orphanages are closed. So I hope that's not too technical.
Thank you. Someone wrote in the chat, thank you so much, because this is such an under-researched area, and I agree, but now we have at least some solid research on this. And Becca, what do you hope this will lead to? What's the next step, or Yeah.
I can start. I think we're really hoping that this first and foremost illuminates that there are pathways in many of these countries, and where those pathways are a bit too restricted based on what Kate was explaining, the definitions of those laws, there is a need to really look at those legal pathways and expand them so that this type of child trafficking and exploitation can be captured. Then we're hoping that will lead to greater awareness of not only the need, but also those pathways, so that those who have the powers and the mandates to implement them will be more conscious of this when they're coming across it. And that will lead to much, a higher level of referrals, a higher level of investigation, and hopefully therefore higher levels of prosecution. And as Kate mentioned in her presentation, that trickle effect to deterrence at the end of the day. So we're hoping that this is a domino piece in that at play that will start to really tip towards greater awareness and greater deterrence of these crimes.
Thank you so much. And time is running really fast when you have so much to say and so great panelists. I would like to give the final words to Barma and then Sinet and ask you, so you have a group of child protection people interested in this area for different parts of the world in the webinar, and it will also, as you know, be posted on the platform for kind of wider dissemination. So what is your message, and what do you hope that all of us will take with us from this? Barma first. Barma, do you hear me? Or do you need translation? No. Can we take Sinet first then? Did you get the question?
Yes. You know, through my experience, I wish back then I really want to like he should be in jail right now, and I don't want all the children who have experience like me to live a life without getting justice. I didn't get my justice until now, and we all can learn from my story that now we can do better. We can do better. That if children have the same story like me today, now at this moment, we absolutely can make a change, and by us all, and we can do better. And those children, they have the right to receive every care they need. And in my case, I don't. And I want all the thing that I don't have back then for those children to have. And we all can learn from our mistake. And for me, I will fight for those children, those youth, those caregivers who have the same experience, the same story like me, like forever. And those children should have access to everything, what they need. We need to support them, and that is their right.
Thank you so much. I think you spoke for both of you, and thank you, Barma and Sinet, for organizing with other caregivers and sharing your experiences. And thank you so much for all the panelists and everybody who listened. And we are sharing this information on the platform, so continue to work together. Thank you so much for today.